In the crowded cafe of the Kingswell Financial Tower, an elegant woman slammed her coffee cup against the counter and demanded the barista make it again, snapping that the milk foam was wrong. No one spoke. Senior executives watched the humiliation unfold as if it were ordinary. The quiet man behind the counter simply wiped the coffee from his sleeve. No argument, no defense. But no one in that room knew who this barista truly was. And no one realized they were the ones being watched, so who was really about to be judged? The Kingswell Financial Tower rose 41 floors above the city, a column of glass and steel that reflected the gray morning sky. At its base, behind a counter of polished walnut, a man named Julian Cross steamed milk into a small steel pitcher and watched the espresso run dark into a white cup. He moved without hurry, without noise, the way a person moves when he has long stopped needing to be noticed. To the hundreds of people who passed through the lobby each morning, he was simply the barista, a face attached to a paper cup forgotten the moment they turned away. Julian preferred it that way. He wore a plain apron over a plain shirt, and he kept his voice low, and even when he took an order. He lived alone in a modest apartment on the far side of the river, a single father who paid his bills on time, and asked nothing of anyone. The people in the tower assumed he had always stood behind a counter, that his world began and ended with the hiss of the machine. None of them knew that the name printed on the deed of the entire building was, in a roundabout and well-buried way, his own. Kingswell Global was preparing for the largest expansion in its history, a plan worth billions, and the board had spent months searching for the right person to sit in the chairman's seat and carry it forward. The decision had narrowed to one obvious favorite. His name moved through the offices the way good news travels quietly and constantly, until it felt less like a possibility and more like a settled fact. That favorite was Ryan Keller, the director of strategy, a man who seemed to have been engineered for the job. He was sharp in meetings, faster with numbers than the analysts who reported to him, and he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who had never been told no. When Ryan spoke, executives leaned forward. When he laughed, the room laughed with him. He was by every metric the company knew how to measure the perfect heir. Beside him almost always was Vanessa Hale. She was elegant in the way that expensive things are elegant, and she understood precisely how much her proximity to Ryan was worth. She wore her status like a coat she never took off, and she had a particular habit that revealed more about her than any conversation could. She was gentle, even charming with anyone who could help her, and dismissive of anyone who could not. What none of them knew, not Ryan, not Vanessa, not the executives who nodded at every word Ryan said, was that Julian had not stumbled into the cafe by accident. He had built Kingswell from a single storefront, decades earlier, had stepped back from the public eye when the company grew too large to recognize his own face in it, and had returned now in an apron because numbers on a report could not tell him the one thing he needed to know. He wanted to see how the people he might soon hand his life's work to behaved when they believed no one important was watching. So he watched. He watched the way Ryan spoke to the cleaning staff, which was to say barely at all. He watched which executives held the elevator and which let the doors close on a slower colleague. He learned the small daily geography of decency in the building, who had it, and who only performed it. And he kept all of it behind the same calm face he showed to every customer who asked for an extra shot. The trouble began, as trouble in that building often did, with Vanessa. She started appearing at the cafe more often than her schedule could possibly require. At first, it was once a day, a flat white she barely touched. Then it was twice, then 3 times, and each visit carried a sharper edge than the last. She would order something, watch Julian make it, and then change her mind the instant he set it down. She would say the espresso tasted burnt, the milk was too hot, the cup was the wrong size, and she would say it loudly enough that the people in line behind her shifted and looked away. Julian remade the drinks without complaint. He did not argue the temperature or defend the beans. He simply poured out the old cup, started again, and slid the new one across the counter with the same steadiness he gave everyone. This patience seemed to irritate Vanessa more than any protest would have. She wanted a reaction, and the absence of one felt to her like a kind of insolence. One morning she leaned against the counter and looked at him the way a person looks at furniture they are deciding to replace. She told him in a voice pitched for the room rather than for him that she did not understand how the building tolerated such sloppy service. She said the people who worked these jobs simply did not care anymore, that there was no pride left in them. The line behind her went quiet. Julian wiped the steam wand clean and asked evenly whether she would like the drink remade. She told him she would like him to learn how to do it right. Ryan was usually there for these performances a few feet away with a phone in his hand. He never joined in, but he never stopped them either. He watched Vanessa work the counter, the way a man watches a show he finds mildly amusing, a half smile on his face, his attention drifting in and out. Once, when Vanessa was particularly cutting, he glanced up, met Julian's eyes for a moment, and looked back down at his screen, as if nothing had happened. The message in that glance was unmistakable. This is not my concern. This person does not register. The other employees in the cafe learned the pattern quickly. When Vanessa arrived, conversations dropped to murmurs. People studied their cups. A young analyst who had once smiled at Julian in passing now kept her eyes on the floor whenever Vanessa was present, and Julian understood why. Ryan Keller was the most powerful name in the building's near future, and no one with a career to protect was going to risk it over the way a woman spoke to a man who made coffee. The silence was not approval. It was arithmetic. Julian absorbed all of it. He noted who flinched and who looked entertained, who left their seats to avoid the scene, and who lingered to enjoy it. He was not collecting grievances. He was collecting truth, and the cafe was giving it to him freely, one ugly morning at a time. Still, something in him tightened a little more each day, a pressure he kept beneath the surface, because the experiment was not finished, and a man behind a counter had no standing to end it. The morning everything shifted began like the others. The cafe was busy, the line long, the air thick with the smell of roasted beans and wet umbrellas. Vanessa came in with 3 colleagues trailing behind her and ordered a tray of drinks, 4 of them complicated each with its own set of demands. Julian made them carefully and set them on the counter in a neat row. Lid sealed names unnecessary, because she had not given any. What happened next did not look like an accident, though later some would call it one. Vanessa reached for the tray, lifted it an inch off the counter and let it tip. The drinks slid, the cups burst, and coffee spread across the floor in a wide brown sheet that crept toward the legs of the people waiting in line. For a moment, the whole cafe held its breath, the way a room does when it senses something has crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. Vanessa looked down at the mess as if it had appeared on its own. Then she looked at Julian, and her voice came out cool and clear and meant for everyone. She told him to clean it up, not to fetch a mop, not to call someone. She told him to get down on the floor and clean it right there in front of the line, in front of the executives, sipping their drinks at the high tables along the window. She said it the way a person gives an order they have given 100 times before and never once been refused. The cafe did not move. The young analyst stared at her shoes. Ryan stood near the window with his coffee, and his half-smile did not falter. The silence stretched until it became its own kind of sound, a pressure in the ears, and Julian set down the cloth in his hand and prepared to do what he had done every other time, which was to absorb it and remain. Then a voice came from the side of the room, rough and unhurried. "That's enough." The man who had spoken was Leonard Brooks, one of the building's maintenance staff, a heavy-set man past 60, with gray in his stubble and a tool bag over his shoulder. He had been changing a fixture near the entrance and had stopped to watch, and now he set the bag down and stepped toward the spreading coffee. He did not raise his voice. He looked at Vanessa the way an older man looks at someone young enough to know better. "You spilled it," Leonard said. "He didn't, and nobody in here is getting on the floor for you." Vanessa turned to face him, surprised, and then visibly annoyed that the surprise had shown. She asked who he thought he was, and Leonard told her plainly that he was the man who would mop the floor because that was his job, and that there was a difference between cleaning a mess and being humiliated for one. He crouched and began wiping the coffee with a rag from his belt, and for a few seconds, the cafe watched a 60-year-old maintenance worker do the thing that 30 well-dressed professionals had been unwilling to do, which was to treat the moment as if decency still applied. Ryan crossed the room then, and Julian watched him closely, because this was the moment that would tell him everything. Ryan did not look at the coffee. He did not look at Julian. He looked at Leonard, and his expression had hardened into something cold and faintly offended, the look of a man whose afternoon had been inconvenienced by an employee forgetting his place. He asked Leonard what his name was and what department he reported to, and the question carried a clear weight beneath it. Leonard answered without standing up. He gave his name, and his department finished wiping the floor and rose with his knees cracking. Ryan held his gaze a moment longer, then turned and guided Vanessa toward the elevators, with a hand at her back, murmuring something that made her laugh. Neither of them looked at the barista again. The line slowly began to move. The young analyst finally lifted her eyes, found Julian watching her, and looked away. Julian picked up the cloth he had set down and wiped the counter that did not need wiping. His hands were steady, but something inside him had gone quiet and final. For weeks he had told himself he was studying behavior, individual choices, the small failures of busy people. He had been prepared to forgive a great deal as the ordinary friction of a crowded morning. But what he had just seen was not one woman behaving badly while one man stood by. It was a structure. Vanessa's cruelty was permitted because Ryan permitted it, and Ryan was permitted because the entire building had decided that proximity to power was worth the price of its own conscience. The only person who had refused that arithmetic was a man with a mop, and his reward had been to have his name written down. Ryan had not seen a person standing up for another person. He had seen insubordination, and he had moved instinctively to punish it. Julian understood, standing there with the cloth in his hand, that the question he had come to answer was no longer about whether Ryan could do the job. Ryan could do the job. He was brilliant at the job. The question was whether the company he had spent his life building had quietly become a place where brilliance excused everything, and dignity counted for nothing, and the answer was already wiped into the floor at his feet. He folded the cloth and laid it beside the machine. Through the tall glass at the front of the cafe, he could see the lobby filling with the late morning crowd, hundreds of people moving through a building that bore his work in every beam and bolt, none of them aware that the man who had made them all possible was standing behind a counter, learning that he had built something he no longer recognized. The experiment, he decided, was over. Not because he had run out of patience, though he had come close. It was over because he finally had his answer, and the answer demanded that he do something with it. The watching was finished. What came next would not be quiet. He looked once more at Leonard Brooks, who had shouldered his tool bag and was heading back toward the fixture by the door as if nothing had happened, as if defending a stranger were simply a thing a person did and not worth remembering. Julian watched him go and made a note, not on paper this time, but somewhere deeper, a note he intended to act on very soon. Then he turned back to the machine, called out the next order in his low and even voice, and began for the last time to make a stranger a cup of coffee. In the days that followed, Ryan Keller moved through the tower like a man already wearing a title that had not yet been announced. He arrived earlier, stayed later, and let his certainty show in small ways, the way he claimed the head of the conference table without being offered it, the way he spoke of the expansion, as though the planning of it already belonged to him. The board had not made anything official, but the building had, and Ryan walked through that quiet consensus as if it were solid ground. Vanessa changed with him. If Ryan behaved as a chairman in waiting, She behaved as though she had already crossed into the highest tier of the company and was merely tolerating the people still beneath her. She spoke to assistants without looking at them. She left her coat for someone else to hang. She had begun to treat the tower as a stage built for her benefit, and the executives who wanted Ryan's favor learned to applaud. Julian saw all of it from behind the counter where he remained, because he had decided that the experiment would end on his terms and not a moment before. He could have walked into the boardroom that same afternoon and ended everything, but a question still held him in the apron. He wanted to know who in the building behaved decently when there was no advantage in it, when kindness cost something and bought nothing in return. So he kept pouring coffee, and he kept watching, and the building kept revealing itself. He noticed which managers softened their voices the instant Ryan entered a room and sharpened them again the moment he left. He noticed the executives who laughed at Vanessa's remarks about the service staff, and then alone at the counter ordered their drinks with the same casual contempt, as if her cruelty had given them permission. He saw how quickly people learned the shape of power and bent themselves to fit it, and how few of them seemed troubled by the bending. He noticed something else, too. Leonard Brooks still nodded at him every morning. The maintenance man came through the lobby with his tool bag, lifted a hand in greeting, and treated Julian no differently than he had before the spill, which was to say, he treated him like a person. Leonard had been written down in Ryan's memory as a problem, and he surely knew it, and yet nothing in his manner had shifted. He had not gone quiet. He had not started avoiding the cafe. He simply went on, being who he was, and Julian found himself watching the older man the way he had once watched the candidates, except that with Leonard, there was nothing to catch. The pressure inside Julian had not eased. If anything, the waiting had compressed it. Every morning he poured drinks for people who had stood in silence, while a woman ordered him onto the floor, and every morning he kept his face calm and his hands steady, and the effort of that calm had begun to cost him in ways he did not show. He had built this place to be better than the world that had once looked at him when he was young and broke and counted for nothing and decided he did not matter. Standing behind the counter, he was learning that he had not built it better at all. He had only built it bigger. The morning of the central confrontation arrived during the busiest hour of the busiest week the cafe had seen all quarter. The expansion was entering its final review, and the tower was thick with visiting executives, board members, and the particular electric tension of a company about to commit billions of dollars and name the person who would spend it. The cafe overflowed. Every high table along the window was taken, and the line ran nearly to the lobby doors. Vanessa came in near the peak of it, and Julian understood the moment he saw her that she had chosen her audience. She wore the room like she owned it, scanned the executives at the tables, and made certain she had their attention before she reached the counter. Ryan came in a step behind her two senior directors, flanking him, the conversation among them easy and self-satisfied. She ordered a single drink and watched Julian make it with the flat, expectant stare he had grown accustomed to. He set it down. She lifted the lid, looked inside, and let her face fold into disgust. Then she did the thing the whole room would remember. She picked up the cup and threw it against the counter hard so that it split and sprayed coffee across the walnut and down the front of Julian's apron, and the sound of it cut through the cafe like a slap. The noise of the room dropped to nothing. Dozens of senior employees turned toward the counter, and Vanessa, with her audience finally secured, delivered the line she had clearly been carrying for days. "This is what happens," she said, loud and bright, "when you let a failed coffee man think his job matters. People like him are replaceable, any one of them. You snap your fingers, and there's another one in the apron by morning." The words hung in the air, and the cafe did what it had always done. It went still and watched and offered nothing. The young analyst was there again near the window, and she pressed her lips together and looked at the floor. The executives at the high tables held their cups and waited to see what they were supposed to think, which meant they waited to see what Ryan thought. Ryan stood a few feet from the counter with his coffee in his hand, and he looked at the broken cup and at the coffee dripping from the edge of the walnut. and at the man in the stained apron standing quietly behind it. And then he laughed. It was not a large laugh, just a short, amused exhale, the sound of a man enjoying a clever performance. But in the silence of that room, it carried to every corner. He turned to one of the directors beside him and said something under his breath, and the director smiled, and the moment was complete. Julian stood in the wreckage of the cup and looked out at the room. He looked at the executives who would not meet his eyes, and at the analyst studying her shoes, and at the director smiling at whatever Ryan had murmured, and at Vanessa basking in the attention she had bought with another person's dignity, and at Ryan, brilliant Ryan, the perfect heir, laughing softly at a man he believed to be nothing. And in that long moment, Julian stopped seeing a cafe full of individuals making small choices. He saw with absolute clarity the true face of the people he had been preparing to hand his life's work to. He had wanted to know how they behaved when no one important was watching, and the room had just answered him completely. They laughed, or they looked away. And not one of them in that crowd of accomplished, well-paid, carefully dressed professionals had found it in themselves to say the simple thing a man with a mop had said days earlier, which was that this was enough. Something in Julian settled into place, cold and certain. He had been carrying the weight of the experiment for weeks, the daily effort of absorbing insult and waiting. And now the waiting was done, and the wait turned into something else. Something with a direction. He was not going to absorb this one. He was not going to remake the cup. He reached down, picked up the largest piece of the broken cup, set it carefully on the counter, and looked at Vanessa with a calm that should have frightened her more than anger would have. He said only that the drink would not be remade, and that she should enjoy the rest of her morning. The flatness of it confused her. She had expected him to bend, as he always had, and the absence of bending left her without a script. She told him she would have him fired by the end of the day, and he said evenly that she was welcome to try. Then he turned away from her and called the next order, and the dismissal in that simple act was so total that her face went red in front of the entire room. Ryan's smile had thinned. Something in the barista's composure had registered as wrong out of pattern, though he could not have said why. He guided Vanessa away from the counter as he had before, but this time, his eyes lingered on Julian, a beat too long. The first flicker of a man sensing the ground beneath him was not as solid as he had assumed. Then the elevator took them up, and the cafe slowly exhaled, and the line began to move, and Julian wiped the coffee from the walnut for the last time. That afternoon, an email went out to the entire leadership of Kingswell Global. It announced a mandatory meeting in the main boardroom the following morning. Every director, every senior executive, every name that mattered. It gave no agenda. It came from the office of the board chairman, and it carried the kind of weight that made schedules rearrange themselves around it. Ryan read it at his desk and felt his certainty bloom into something close to triumph. A mandatory full leadership meeting with no agenda called by the board on the eve of the expansion's final approval could mean only one thing. They were going to announce the chairmanship. They were going to announce him. He leaned back in his chair, looked out over the city, and let himself enjoy the view of a future he believed he had already won. Vanessa took the news the way she took everything that confirmed her sense of where she belonged. She treated the meeting as a coronation she was entitled to attend. She spoke that evening of the people she would no longer have to tolerate, the rooms she would now be invited into the version of her life that was finally about to begin in earnest. She had spent weeks performing power in a cafe, and now she believed the real thing was being placed in her hands, and she prepared for it the way a person prepares to step permanently into the company of the elite. Julian spent the same evening differently. The humiliations in the cafe had not been private. They had unfolded in front of the building's most senior people again and again in a public space owned by the company, and the building's own security systems had recorded all of it, without anyone giving it a thought, because no one records a barista. He had the footage gathered, not staged, not provoked, simply the plain record of what the room had already seen with its own eyes. He set it beside the notes he had carried in his head for weeks, the quiet inventory of who in the building had a conscience and who only had ambition. He was careful with all of it because he understood the difference between exposing the truth and manufacturing it, and he had no interest in becoming the kind of man who manufactured anything. He did not need to twist a single moment. The moments had spoken for themselves loudly in front of witnesses. All he intended to do was make the building look at what it had already chosen to ignore. There was a moment late that night alone when the cold certainty wavered into something heavier. He thought about the version of himself who had once stood at the bottom of a building, like this one, young and broke, learning that the people above him did not see him as fully human. He had built Kingswell partly to never feel that again, and partly so that no one who worked for him ever would. With the footage cued and the meeting set, he understood that he had failed at the second thing, and that the failure was his to answer for as much as anyone's. But understanding the failure did not soften what came next. It sharpened it. A man who had been hurt by indifference and then built a company that produced indifference at scale did not get the luxury of looking away from it. He had learned exactly what he needed to learn. Now the apron had one more thing to do. He thought about Ryan reading that email, certain it was a coronation. He thought about Vanessa preparing for a life that was about to be taken from her in a single morning. He felt no satisfaction in it, which surprised him a little, only a flat resolve, the same resolve that had let him build the place to begin with. The brilliant heir and his proud companion had spent weeks revealing precisely who they were to a man they believed could do nothing about it. Tomorrow, they would learn, in front of everyone whose opinion they had ever cared about exactly who that man was. The next morning, the leadership of Kingswell Global filed into the main boardroom on the 40th floor, a long table of glass, and the city spread out behind it through a wall of windows. Ryan took a seat near the head as he always did, and Vanessa stood along the side with the others, who had been invited to witness rather than to sit. The room hummed with anticipation, certain it knew what it had come to hear. At the appointed hour, the board chairman rose to make an introduction, and the room turned toward the door, expecting a name they already knew. The door opened, and the man who walked in was not dressed like a chairman or a director or an executive of any kind. He walked in wearing a plain shirt and the same apron he had worn behind the counter every morning, still faintly stained, and the entire boardroom went silent in a way that no email could have produced. Ryan's face moved through confusion toward something colder as he tried and failed to make sense of why the barista from downstairs was standing at the front of the room he had expected to be handed. Vanessa's hand rose halfway to her mouth, and before either of them could speak, the chairman of the board gestured toward the man in the apron and began to say the words that would take everything Ryan Keller believed he had won and turn it in front of every person he had ever hoped to impress into ash. The chairman spoke into the silence and introduced the man in the stained apron as the founder and true chief executive of Kingswell Global, the person whose name sat beneath every layer of the company they all served. He explained briefly that Julian Cross had stepped back from public view years earlier and had returned in recent weeks, not to inspect the numbers, which were strong, but to see the company as it actually was when it believed no one of consequence was watching. The boardroom did not react the way rooms react to surprising news. It reacted the way a room reacts to a floor giving out beneath it. The executives who had laughed at the cafe, who had looked away, who had ordered their drinks with casual contempt, sat very still as they recalculated every morning they had spent, pretending the barista did not exist. Vanessa's hand was still half raised toward her mouth, and the color had drained entirely from her face. Ryan recovered fastest because Ryan always recovered fastest. He rose partway from his chair and began to say that there had clearly been a misunderstanding, that the company's performance under his strategy spoke for itself, that whatever this was could surely be discussed. He was reaching for the only ground he had ever known, the ground of competence, and for a moment, it almost held him upright. Julian let him speak, and then he turned to the wall of screens at the end of the room. The footage began to play. It was not edited into a weapon. It was simply the plain record the building had captured on its own. Vanessa changing her order again and again while the line waited. Vanessa ordering a man onto the floor to clean a mess she had made. The cup shattering against the walnut counter, the coffee across the apron, and her bright, carrying voice calling the man behind it a failure who could be replaced by morning. And then the camera, indifferent and exact, found Ryan a few feet away with his coffee in his hand. It caught the broken cup and the dripping counter and the short, amused exhale of a laugh and the way he leaned toward the director beside him to share something quiet, while a man stood humiliated in front of the entire room. Ryan watched himself laugh on the screen, and the strategy left his face. He understood all at once that there was no version of this he could talk his way out of, because the thing on the screen was not an accusation. It was simply him. Every executive in the room was watching the perfect heir reveal exactly what he became when he believed the only people watching were the ones who did not matter, and the image of the flawless leader that had carried him to the edge of the chairmanship dissolved in the space of a few minutes of plain footage. Vanessa was asked to leave the building. There was no speech made of it. A member of the board's staff simply opened the door and stood beside it. And Vanessa, who had spent weeks treating the tower as a stage built for her, walked the length of that long room under the eyes of every person whose admiration she had craved, and out through the door, and was gone. The status she had worn like a coat had been the only thing she had, and it came off in front of all of them at once. Julian let the screens go dark before he spoke, and when he did, his voice was the same low and even voice he had used to call orders across the cafe, the voice of a man who did not need volume to be heard. He told the room that he had not come back to test anyone's skill. The skill, he said, had never been in question. Ryan Keller was as capable as any executive the company had ever produced, and that was precisely the point. Competence, Julian said, was not what made a person fit to lead. Competence was common. It could be hired, trained, and measured. What could not be hired was the thing a person became when the room emptied of people worth impressing, and that was the only thing he had come to measure. He said that the true standard of Kingswell, the one that had never been written into any policy, was simple. It was the way a person treated those who could do nothing for them. Anyone could be gracious to the people who held their future. Anyone could perform decency in a meeting. The test was the man behind the counter, the woman who hung the coats, the maintenance worker on his knees with a rag, the people whose names the powerful never bothered to learn. How a person treated them was not a small thing. It was the whole thing. It was the only honest measure of who they were. Then he turned to Ryan and dismissed him there in front of the leadership he had expected to be handed. There was no cruelty in it. Julian did not raise his voice or sharpen the words. He simply said that a man who could watch another person be degraded for his own amusement could not be trusted with the lives of 41 floors of employees, no matter how brilliant his strategy, and that the chairmanship would not be his, and neither would his current seat. Ryan gathered himself with the last of his composure and walked out, and the door closed behind him with no more sound than any door. Julian announced that an internal review would open across Ryan's entire division, not to hunt for people to punish, but to understand how a culture had taken root in which so many capable people had decided that silence was the safest investment. He said it plainly, looking around the table at the executives who had looked away in the cafe, and he watched the recognition move across their faces. He was not threatening them. He was telling them that he had seen them, and that being seen was now the condition of staying. In the days that followed, something shifted in the building that was harder to name than a firing. People who had spent years measuring every word against the question of who held power began quietly to reckon with how long they had stayed silent in the presence of contempt. The young analyst from the cafe, the one who had studied her shoes through every humiliation, came to Julian's office unprompted, and said only that she was sorry that she had seen it, and said nothing. and that she did not want to be a person who saw and said nothing. He told her that the fact she had come to say it was the part that mattered. Julian did not stop at removing one man. He turned to the machinery that had produced him. The system that decided who rose at Kingswell had rewarded political instinct, the ability to read power and bend toward it. And it had been almost perfectly silent on the question of character. He rebuilt it. Promotion would now weigh how a person led others, how they treated the people beneath them, whether the respect they showed survived the absence of an audience. The things that could not be put on a resume became the things the company learned to look for. He went in person to find Leonard Brooks. He found him exactly where he expected, on a ladder near a fixture tool bag at his feet, doing his job as though the events of the past weeks had been someone else's story. Julian told him what he had done, that he had stood up in a silent cafe and said the thing that 30 professionals could not, and that he had done it for a stranger he believed to be powerless, with nothing to gain and a written reprimand to lose. Leonard climbed down from the ladder and said he had not done anything special. He said a person spilled their own drink, and a person did not get on the floor for it, and that was about as complicated as it had ever seemed to him. He had not known who Julian was. That Julian told him was the entire point. Leonard had not been kind to a chief executive in disguise. He had been kind to a barista because kindness to a barista had never required a reason. Julian offered him a place in a new program the company was building, a leadership track for people who would help reshape how Kingswell treated its own. Leonard protested that he fixed light fixtures and did not belong in a boardroom, and Julian told him that belonging in a boardroom had been exactly the problem that the company had spent years filling those rooms with people who fit them, and forgetting to ask whether any of them deserved to be there. He did not need more people who fit the room. He needed people who would not laugh at a broken cup. Others were found the same way. The analyst who had come to apologize, a manager who it turned out had quietly reported Vanessa's behavior weeks earlier through a channel that had gone nowhere, a report that had been buried by someone protecting Ryan. The people who had shown some flicker of conscience or courage when it cost them something were given new room to rise, and word of why they were rising moved through the building faster than any policy memo. And slowly the arithmetic of the place began to change. When it was finished, when the meetings were over, and the reviews were underway, and the building had begun unevenly to become something a little closer to what he had once meant it to be, Julian went back down to the cafe on the ground floor. It was late, and the lobby was nearly empty, and the machine behind the counter had gone quiet for the night. He took the apron from where it hung and held it for a moment. It was still faintly marked from the morning the cup had broken against the walnut. He thought about the weeks he had spent inside it, and about the version of himself who had once been unseen without any choice at all. Young and broke in a building like this one, certain that the people above him would never look at him as a person. He had built this entire place so that he would never feel that again, and he had nearly handed it to a man who would have made others feel it every day. He folded the apron carefully the way he had folded 100 cloths over those weeks, and he laid it on the counter where the cup had broken. He did not need it anymore. It had done the one thing no report and no interview and no quarter of strong numbers could ever have done. It had shown him the truth of his own company by making him small enough to see it from below. Through the tall glass at the front of the cafe, he looked out and then up at the floors, rising above him into the dark hundreds of windows, thousands of people, an entire structure built on his work, and very nearly given the wrong soul. Kingswell would enter its expansion now under a different standard than the one it had almost adopted, a standard that asked not only what a person could do, but who they became when they thought it did not count. He left the apron on the counter and walked out through the lobby he had crossed every morning as a stranger, and no one stopped him because there was no one left to stop him, and that was fine. He had never needed to be seen. He had only needed to see. Status did not create a person's character. It had never created anything. It only revealed what had been there all along the way. The empty cafe late at night revealed the marks on a folded apron. The way a man treated the people who could do nothing for him, who could not lift him, or reward him, or remember his name was not a detail of his character. It was the truest measure of his worth there would ever be.